The average American is not, nor should they have to be prepared to fight every day of their life for basic civil rights.
The bedrock of the United States of America is to bestow rights to every individual and grant equality to all. And both the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution grant people these securities. However, it took many conflicts and compromises for certain individuals to receive these rights. Since impairments were first discovered as far back as 35,000 BC, there has been a great deal of conflict facing people with disabilities. Until about the mid-1950s, most individuals with disability were regarded as abnormal or insane. Large populations of disabled people were held in asylums and mental institutions. Along with being tortured by a not-so-empathetic outside world, they were being tortured within their own minds. And not a single soul seemed interested in helping them. And the treatments of the day were horrific, and the approaches of therapy were obscene. Therapy consisted of shock treatment, ice baths, ankle and arm restraints, insulin coma therapy, trephinition, and lobotomies. But no matter how often these handicapped patients cried in agony, these early methods were all seen as healthy reactions with the potential for healing.
Disabled people would have been pretty much shut away and hardly visible. I think that must have had an enormous impact on the way disabled people were viewed and were treated by their society.
In the midst of World War II, thousands of American soldiers put their lives at risk. As many arrived home in 1945 with mental and physical injuries, they raised the percentage of Americans with disabilities. As they worked themselves back into society, there were many conflicts that arose: rights, benefits, and employment. Sadly, American society refused to view disabilities as a civil rights issue and opposed many measures to secure equal rights for them. But this was one of the first times these issues were brought to the attention of the American public. Suddenly, disability rights became a much more expressive matter in everyday politics. Veterans and their families were getting public and congressional attention, making the situations for handicapped people more visible. They began to speak out and advocate for compromises to be made, thus beginning the disability rights movement. Fortunately, in 1960, the concept of independent living for individuals with disabilities was introduced. The independent living philosophy was the conviction that people with disabilities desire to lead the fullest lives possible, outside of institutions, integrated into the community, exercising full freedom of choice. A key event took place in 1960, when Ed Roberts planned on attending University of California, Berkeley, but after being rejected because he had polio, Roberts began his activism. He created a group called the Rolling Quads that developed positive disability identity to non-disabled observers. Because of this, Roberts was finally admitted in 1962, helping make UC Berkeley a hotspot for student protest. He became known as the father of the independent living movement, and just as prominent to the disabled community as Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X were to the civil rights movement. Although his conflict and compromise with UC Berkeley was just a fragment of what continued on with the disability rights movement.
Well, yeah, there were certain leaders, people like Ed Roberts in Berkeley, who really started pushing the idea of independent living and empowerment of people with disabilities.
In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was introduced and helped end discrimination against African Americans and women in the workplace, but it did not make any provisions for people with disabilities. Inspired by the success of the American Civil Rights Movement, many disabled people began to protest and lobby. They challenged the existing power structure, which was the United States government. They began to utilize methods of protest similar to the civil rights movement, such as sit-ins and freedom rides. Their plight needed to be expressed and told just like any other discriminated segment of society. But with insistent peaceful protesting not being successful, they soon realized they were going to have to shift their strategy, and this strategy would involve civil disobedience.
So the whole idea behind the disability rights movement is that disability is not just sort of some individual problem. There's something wrong with your body, and too bad for you, and we feel sorry for you. Instead, it's a social problem. The disability rights movement way of thinking about it is that society needs to be constructed in ways that work for everybody.
As the disability rights movement slowly began gaining ground with their new strategies, a sad but noteworthy event occurred that brought national attention and helped in the fight for equality in handicapped communities. In 1965, Senator Robert Kennedy paid an unannounced visit to Willowbrook School on Staten Island in New York City, and found thousands of residents living in a grotesque environment.
I first heard of this big place with the pretty sounding name because of a call I received from a member of the Willowbrook staff, Dr. Michael Wilkins. The doctor invited me to see the conditions he was talking about, so unannounced and unexpected by the school administration, we toured building number 6. The doctor had warned me that it would be bad. It was horrible.
And a few years later, in 1972, ABC News Investigate correspondent Geraldo Rivera did an unprecedented story regarding the situation at Willowbrook. He uncovered the foundation's serious overcrowding, dehumanizing practices, unsafe conditions, and customary mishandle of occupants. In April 1973, U.S. Region Court Judge Orrin G. Judd found that the conditions in Willowbrook disregarded the sacred right of people living in state custodial foundations to be shielded from harm. The case was settled, and Judge Judd marked the Willowbrook Assent Judgment, which put forward rules and necessities for those living in the Willowbrook institution to live in safe and proper settlement. Meanwhile, the disability rights movement continued with constant boycotts, blocking traffic, and protest marches that began to occur regularly in front of the White House and the Health, Education, and Welfare Building. In the early 1970s, people began declaring their support for a specific piece of legislation, the ratification of the Rehabilitation Act. With the help of their activism, the Rehabilitation Act passed in 1973 and marked the greatest achievement up to that time for the disability rights movement.
Early 70s, the Rehabilitation Act passed that required a degree of access in federally funded programs and institutions. But all these things lacked teeth, didn't have really good enforcement, and were kind of narrowly defined.
The Rehabilitation Act, particularly Section 504, challenged discrimination against people with disabilities. Although this act was just a small stepping stone with temporary compromise, it was a beginning, but with more conflict to come. It was easy to proclaim equality on paper, but hard to produce it and ensure it became a reality. In 1990, as compromises slowly began to progress for the handicapped community, one of the most influential events of the disability rights movement took place, the Capitol Crawl. The House Committee on Public Works and Transportation was stalling the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA would be the first legal guarantee of public access change and the biggest step of equality for those with disabilities since the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Since the bill was continuously ignored, disability rights activists, specifically the organization ADAPT, made the most widespread noise. Thousands of protesters came from across the country. It would be an unbelievable and momentous demonstration, as hundreds of activists abandoned their wheelchairs and mobility devices and began to crawl up the 83 stone steps of the U.S. Capitol building, shouting and demanding the passing of the significant act. In that same year, representatives from the disability community met with administration officials to explain why more compromises were needed and that all of the ADA should be adopted in full. These high-level meetings would not have continued or been successful without the constant bombardment of letters to the White House from people with disabilities and parents of children with disabilities across the country.
Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down. God bless you all.
Finally, due to the immense amount of pressure and the growing sentiment of the American public, the Senate voted overwhelmingly 76-8 in favor of the ADA. On July 26, 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law. The compromises were immediately felt. Individuals with disabilities can now enjoy increased opportunity to live, work, and be able to play in their communities. More individuals with disabilities are living freely in their communities than ever before. The ADA touches almost every part of regular day-to-day existence for individuals with disabilities. Unfortunately, the Americans with Disabilities Act could not repair every horror that people with disabilities had to deal with prior to the act. It could not erase the fact that many had been trapped in cellars, attics, and horrific state institutions. Most unfortunate, having to know that being born with a disability or acquiring them as children was going to result in being raised with the negative stereotypes that were shared with the Broad Society, that they had been cursed by God or were being punished by a bad karma. However, it did begin meaningful and true compromises to the conflict that existed for hundreds of years. Those who had fought tirelessly for disability rights now had a foundation through countless compromises, and finally from the benefit of the ADA to help them feel safe and productive in America. Although the compromise of the ADA helped the disability rights movement immensely, the disabled community continues to fight for equality in many areas and for a variety of reasons. A fight that is bound to continue until full equality for disabled people is finally reached.